Welcome today, our audience in Cambridge and online, to the next Faraday Institute for Science and Religion seminar in this series this term. And I will introduce our speaker. So this is Dr. Graeme Finlay, who I've just been reminded came to speak at the Faraday Institute when we started in 2006. We've been in touch ever since. In a number of ways, not least some of his books and publications. His latest is God's Gift of Science, the Theological Presuppositions Underlying Exploration of the Natural World. Graeme trained as a cell biologist and was involved in cancer research and teaching scientific pathology in the University of Auckland. Now he's retired, he has able to spend a lot more time thinking about the relationship between his science and his Christian faith. And I was delighted to see this title today, Why Biological Evolution Should Inspire Worship, which is a very thought-provoking, challenging and inspiring title for us to think about today. So over to you, Graeme, and we'll just get rid of the history.
Well, I'm hugely privileged to be back with you in Cambridge again, and with the Faraday Institute. Discussing my subject today with Dennis Alexander a short time ago, I just expressed how this issue is perhaps more urgent in New Zealand, where I come from, because many of the biggest, most active, most lively churches, full of young people, tend to have a very Americanized theology, tend to be very, very suspicious about science in general and about evolution in particular. So that's one of the reasons I've had this urge within myself for the last over 20 years to explain to people why evolution is no threat to our Christian faith. In fact, I've become very excited about it. As I thought more about it. And indeed, I believe that we should allow evolution to inspire worship because of what it tells us about the way that God works. So, I got this from the ISCAS website. That's the Australian Fellowship of Science and Theology. Mark Knoll, the historian, said Christians who rigidly adhere to long-held beliefs regarding how God made physical and biological reality have, quote, they forfeited the opportunity to glorify God for the way he has made nature. And I think that's very true. If we get locked into some traditions which are not biblical, which are inherited, but we haven't thought them through, then we've lost out on the opportunity to see God in his greatness, God in his magnificence, in his way in which he has created the world, or in which he still creates the world as a continual relationship of love and power between God and us as creatures. So my approach now, as it has been in the past, so forgive me, it's a little bit what you've been used to, Ruth. I give a few insights from science, first of all, from the area of genomic science. I'm not a molecular biologist. I am a cell biologist, and for years I was not interested in evolution. But when the genome was published, it suddenly became cell biology. And wow, that became very interesting to me. So just a little bit about the biology which I have drawn from in describing my point of view over the last few months, or few years rather, and then we'll talk about some of the theological interpretations of this. So the way I look at it, we use the New Testament as Christians, as believers in Jesus, to interpret the Old. The Old points to Jesus, and when we read the New Testament, we say, that's what Isaiah was talking about, or Moses, or whoever. And in the same way, I believe as a Christian, we should use the Bible to interpret what we see in nature around us. So we should be very honest about our interpretations. I mean, some people like Richard Dawkins are unaware that they interpret their science. They are very naive in that regard. So I do interpret my biology through the lens of Christian faith. And what I am going to talk about today is based on a paper which has just come up in Scientia et Fides by the same title, Why Biological Evolution Should Inspire Worship. So first of all, just a little bit about some genetics and how reading in biomedical science took me right into the mainstream of evolutionary thought. And this simple diagram illustrates the way by which a group of viruses called retroviruses infect cells and in many cases cause disease. So we start up at the top with, is the cursor working? Yes, there we are, with a retrovirus particle. And it's got a green bar in it, which represents its genetic material, which in the retrovirus is ribonucleic acid, RNA. When the virus infects a cell, that RNA is transformed into another sort of genetic material called DNA, which is what we have as our genetic material. And then something very, very cunning happens. A virus enzyme, rather at random, selects what we could call a target site in the cellular DNA. So this black line just represents the cellular DNA. And just to let you know, if you haven't thought about it before, every cell of our body contains 2 meters of DNA. So that's an enormous amount of DNA, unless we're a red cell, of course. That's an enormous amount of DNA packed up into something like 10 micrometers in diameter. So the virus enzymes select this target site and then insert the virus DNA into that target site so that the target site sequence, which is about 4 chemical letters long, sandwiches the virus insert. So when we see a virus insert and it's surrounded, it's bracketed both ends by the same little repeat, DNA repeat, we know that that's been introduced by virus enzymes. And medically, this strategy causes some very serious diseases. So the most famous retrovirus is the AIDS virus, HIV, which is a retrovirus. And a slightly less well-known one is the human T-cell leukemia virus, which causes a very aggressive virus in certain populations around the world, not in Europe. So here is just one example, where at the very top, I've got the ends of the retroviral sequence. So that's the green bits, and the 3 little dots in the middle means that there's hundreds of those chemical letters which comprise our DNA information. Hundreds of chemical letters in between. But the whole thing is up to 1,000 bases long. And then the black lettering represents cellular DNA. A, C, T, G, which are the 4 chemical letters which comprise our genome. And you can see I've got some in bold at either end. That's the duplication of the target site. And here you can see it's CCAG on both sides. So that's the sequence that the virus enzyme recognized that put the virus, insert the green bit into there and duplicated the target site. And I can tell you how it works afterwards if you want to know. But the question is, we find that in our DNA. You and I have got that virus insert, and it's not causing AIDS or HIV, but rather it's an endogenous retrovirus which we've inherited from our parents, and they're from theirs. And in fact, every human being contains this retrovirus, indicated by the DNA written in green. So where did it come from? How long has it been there? Might we find it in other species? And we can. We can now look at other species because so many genomes have been sequenced. And here I've got the same bit of DNA from the pygmy chimp and the common chimp, Troglodytes, Paniscus and Pantroglodytes. So what do we infer from that? We infer from that that single event occurred in a cell, in a reproductive cell, which was ancestral to humans and chimps. And so, whereas for 140 years, people were entitled perhaps to argue about evolution, when this sort of thing came out, and it was there for all to see, that's when I came to see, look, evolution is so certain. I must get out and tell my fellow Christians about it so they don't worry and don't argue about it. But we haven't finished the story. Okay, humans, chimps, and bonobos have that same sequence. With this particular insert, how far can we go? And this is a fun thing to do on a rainy day, because you can spend a lot of time with open databases and look at lots and lots of different species. And you can see that that same viral insert is there in all the apes, including the lesser apes, the gibbon. In the old world monkeys, that's the drill, the macaque, the baboon, and the green monkey, and the snub-nosed monkey, and also in new world monkeys. That's the marmoset, the night monkey, the squirrel monkey, and the capuchin monkey. So all of the simian primates, that's you and me, and those monkey species, have that same insert, bracketed by the same target site duplication. And therefore the inference, well, the very confident inference we can make is that that insertion event occurred in an ancestor of all simian primates. If you look further afield to the Tarsian, which is a prosimian species, then you just find the undisturbed target site. Okay, so that's a tarsia down here, 6 from the bottom. There's CCCAG. It's still the same target site. It's quite amazing, isn't it, to think you can find the target site there in the tarsia, which has probably existed from before the time when the Himalayas were raised. That shows the stability, the flexibility of DNA. The II is another prosimian. The colugo is a flying lemur, which isn't a primate, and you can even find it in some other mammal species, the horse and the wild ass. The point about this, and maybe I'll have to abbreviate some of what I'm saying, is that many of these inserts, they just don't sit around in our DNA, but they have been recruited into performing essential functions. And this little diagram just indicates a green box on the left, on the right there, which represents a gene. Obviously, there aren't boxes in our DNA, but cell biologists just put boxes to indicate a particular length of DNA. So this represents a gene. And this grey box here represents another class of endogenous inherited retrovirus. And now these retroviruses have sites which bind cellular proteins, indicated by these green and red boxes, which can be recruited to the DNA because there are binding sites in the retrovirus, this green bar and this red bar. And so these, oops, bit ahead of myself. So these proteins, these ovals, can control the adjacent gene. So these retroviruses have come to donate sequences which are involved in gene expression. And this is the next picture I'll show you is a particular retrovirus called a MER41. It's here at the bottom, and it controls a gene needed in trophoblast cells. And trophoblast cells are those involved in production of the placenta. So the placenta is now at least partially the result of regulatory mechanisms which have been randomly added to our DNA, but recruited to perform functions so that genes can be turned on and off in a mammal or a primate or a monkey or a human-specific way. And this particular retrovirus, you can see the same pattern, also entered our DNA in ancestor of simian primates, because it's there in all simian primates, but not on the tarsier or prosimians or the horse or cattle or the dolphin. So we've got an amazing vista into our past. You'll also notice that just here, there's a bit of a deletion. Some of the retrovirus has fallen out, and that occurs in the baboon, the macaque, and the green monkey. It occurred in an ancestor of the old world monkeys. So these sorts of additional mutational events indicate other branches to the primate family tree. That's taken me a third of my time, or probably more. So I'll skip over the next lot because I want us to think about this sort of how we can interpret this sort of science and why I get excited about it. I must just say, there are 4 million of these types of inserts in our DNA. If we've got 2 meters of DNA in every cell, fully half of them comes from retroviruses or another similar phenomenon, the jumping genes. And there are 4 million of those individual units in our DNA, which were added randomly way back through history, some of which now perform essential functions. And nearly all of them are shared with chimps. So here is an incredible burden of evidence for our common ancestry. So why should we rejoice as Christians or as believers in a self-revealing God from this sort of science? I mean, we could get excited about science, for one thing. And my first point is that this sort of comparative genomics reveals, it's a powerful mechanism of revealing evolution's past mechanism. And in fact, I believe as a Christian, from having read in science for 40 years, I'm not a historian, I'm not a philosopher, don't know anything about the evolution of ideas, but my reading over these years has enabled me to see that science arose as an expression of Christian theology, Christian worship. And the sorts of findings which I've just discussed, to me, indicate the power of science and therefore vindicate Christian theologians over many, many, many centuries who have sought to understand the world. So this isn't so much a European thing as a science thing. I'm a white inferiorist. But what gave power to the great early scientists, you know, back in Oxford, you know, the Thomas Bradwardine and Richard Hastings and all those mathematicians and those early scientists, was that they were theologians who believed in the self-revealing God. And that's got another way. And that's why my first book was written quite soon after it came out to the Faraday Institute in 2006. So Dennis said it was quite legitimate. In fact, Dennis encouraged me just to mention my book. So that is largely a book about this sort of genetic evidence, in which I do show that I have sympathies for the Christian faith, but I don't actually push it. So that's a CFU book, and it came out a year ago in paperback, so you can now buy that for about a third of the original price. So we look at our own DNA, and we see that there's a source of powerful phylogenetic markers, powerful evolutionary markers. We can see about these endogenous retroviruses and about TE jumping genes, which are similar sorts of things. They're disruptive, but they're tolerated. They disrupt genomes, but they're varying genomes of all animals. Why do we tolerate something which is disruptive? It's because they give us genetic flexibility. They promote evolvability, if you like. So they have enabled us to do all of that. So the ones I've shown, the example I've shown provides regulatory motifs in our DNA. We can call these ones enhancers, which modify the body plan. So they give us these days a human body plan. Chimp-specific endogenous retroviruses give you a chimp body plan, and so forth, cats and dogs and fish and And the other thing I didn't talk about is retrogenes. And you know, it's just light. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not an astronomer, but It's amazing how also, people argue for 300 years perhaps about some of Copernicus's hypotheses. It took 300 years to find a really powerful demonstrative proof, which was as far as the revolution of the Earth, Foucault's pendulum, and as far as the Earth's revolution around the sun, it was still a parallax, which are indicated by those diagrams. And again, I'm not an astronomer, but it just excites me to see how after 300 years, eventually this powerful scientific evidence came. Here's a NASA picture from their New Horizons spacecraft, which I found online, which is now 4 billion miles out in space. In fact, that's a human artifact which is so far from Earth that you can see stellar paradox with Proxima Centauri, our nearest star next to the sun. So, New Horizons, Earth. New Horizons, Earth. So, the powerful demonstrations are there, which is a wonderful vindication of the power of science. And hence my most recent book, God's Gift of Science. I think I stole the term unconsciously from the late Tom McLeish, who spoke so much about God's gift of science. But the presuppositions are biblical. So I find a lot of pleasure in that. The second thing, we find, looking at the genome, we find biology as historical. It's not static. God would make us instantaneously just like this. But we have a long history. And to me, that's really exciting because it brings so many spheres of knowledge together. C.P. Snow, again, whom I've never read, many of you are physicists, he said that there's a big gap, a big void between the humanities and the sciences. But I think theology is certainly an interpretation of history. Christian theology is an interpretation of history. It's an interpretation of Israel's history. It's an interpretation of the history of Jesus. So theology is a deeply empirical science, if in the sense that it's historical. But now, looking at the genome and seeing the genome as a historical record brings our genetic science into the historical sphere. And so science and theology have this commonality that they are both interpretations of our history. And I'm sure the physicists among us could go on and on about how, looking out into space, you see things which happened in the past. So we could take a number of markers, and in the paper here are some of them, and you can use those markers, individual inserts, plot zillions of them together, and you get a family tree of the mammals or of the vertebrates or whatever. So this historical approach is very powerful and it tells us so much about our past. So the genome, our genome, is a cumulative record of its own formation. And as John Hockingward said, dearly beloved, I'm sure right us here, what science can tell us about the history of this creation, that God is patient and subtle, and he is content to work through unfolding process. My theology professor wrote this, Alio Kurd, who was a Dutch Reformed theologian. He said, God fashions history at definite and decisive moments. He wrote, the whole of Jesus' life and history is eschatology. The doctrine of how God is working in his world, and we get that from the history of Jesus. It's this empirical data of history which form our faith. And Tom Wright and Michael Bird have said historical data properly interpreted and responsibly appropriated and applied carry prescriptive force for what the followers of Jesus believe in the task to which they are called. Historical data, he's obviously there speaking as New Testament scholars, but historical data have authority. They have force. They limit what we can believe. And they inform what we believe as Christians. And as a Christian, I have confidence in the gospel because it is not cleverly made up fables. but it has this anchor in history. And so when we look at God's creation, I love to think of it this way. God's creations all have histories. And therefore, don't allow Professor Dawkins or other people to confuse you, or those you know, because histories are part of creations. They are not alternatives to creation. So the cosmos, which is God's creation, has a history of something like 13.8 billion years. Life may be also God's creation. Psalm 104, God gives life continuously, but it's been around for 3.9 billion years. Israel is God's creation. It says so very clearly in Isaiah, various other places. God is the creator of Israel, but it's history. So far, it's 4,000 years. The church is created by God, in Ephesians chapter 2, but it has a history of 2,000 years so far. And I am God's creation, Psalm 139, or God's new creation. But I also have a history of something like 70 years. So histories are part of creation, and therefore we shouldn't be embarrassed by evolutionary thought or the magnitude of the time scales of which they speak. Thirdly, I wonder at the potentiality in creation. And we can see that, we can read that in our own genomes, but there is this potentiality, which I believe as a follower of Jesus, that the Creator God has ordained should be part of this created world. So here I'm quoting Leibniz in Andrew Briggs's book with other physicists. God builds things to realize his ends without ever having to step in to make adjustments. One who trusts in God should find no gaps in nature. We don't look for gaps. We don't look for discontinuities into which we can plug God, as so many Christians so often do. But we can look at our genome, for example, and every one of those insertion events is a piece of history. It's a historical data. And those 4 million insertions, which we share with other mammals, largely with other mammals, a few with species more distant, they form a continuous history, which we can only believe is the outwork of the purposes of God. This potentiality is based into the world that God has made. Creation is so constituted that natural historical process can realize the potential intrinsic to itself. Clearly, the quote to come comes from the 19th century, but Tom Wright again was very happy to use it. He uses the same metaphor in discussion of God's creative work in the Genesis account. God is said to have made a world that will then make itself. That came from Charles Kingsley, didn't it? But Tom Wright, as a Christian theologian, isn't scared to use the same terminology. And in fact, Holmes Rawlson, the philosopher, he quotes Jesus, who really says the same thing. And he says, the earth produces of itself automatically, and the Greek word there, I'm not Greek, but here it is, automate. It produces of itself. This is a world in which God has embedded this fruitfulness, that it develops and changes and grows in response to the lawfulness which he has given. So this automatic, if you like, growth denotes an innate principle of the spontaneous origination of order. That is of Genesis. And we can look at different levels. Self-organization in organisms, biogenesis, or species, phylogenesis, or ecosystems, ecogenesis. And another term which I think I first came across in Ralston, but I do love it, is autopoiesis. And I've defined it as this exuberant capacity of life to perpetuate itself and to develop new capacities. And to me, it's a miracle. Someone was just mentioning it before we sat down while we were having lunch. that this life bursts out. And I don't even know how to ask the questions, but it seems such an amazing, miraculous thing, that such powers are built into life. And I see those as coming from the hand of God. And hence my other book, Evolution and Eschatology, which just takes the approach I've taken today. It looks at different aspects of our body. The placenta, the brain, the immune system. And it sees how they have developed in response to these sorts of genetic mechanisms. But how we can interpret those through Christian eyes and see how God is taking his creation forward. The fourth thing, which is a special case, is how evolutionary process has discovered person. And we are here because we are able to reflect on our past. We can consider our future. We can worship a God we cannot see. We can form deep relationships, which are not instinctive. Hidden in our typically hominoid genome is the potential to apprehend a world of value, morality, destiny, and worship. And I quote Simon Conway Morris here, who most of you will know very well, I'm sure, as an outcome of evolution. Rationality is not so much a question of emergence, but one of discovery. So it reflects the rationality of the God who is there, the God who transcends this physical world. So it enables us to discover a prior life. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that's just the reference, just indicating how jumping genes and retroviruses have had an enormous role in the development of the human brain. So humans are the ape that can know God. It sounds kind of paradoxical, perhaps. Biologically, of course, we are apes. There's no doubt about that. We're not just descended from apes, but biologically we are apes. We are anthropoid hominoid primates. But theologically, we are made in the image of God. We have this amazing dignity that God has given to us. And in fact, there's a big trap we can get into, because many materialistically minded scientists will tell us that they emphasize the doctrine of non-exceptionalism, non-exceptionality. And biologically, that may be true. You look around the DNA and you couldn't really tell whether you were looking at a chimp DNA or a human DNA. The doctrine of non-exceptionalism. But when you look at us as people, that doctrine breaks down, and I have no hesitation in up to hearing to the doctrine of exceptionalism. And although atheists don't like it, if they reject our exceptionalism, then they close their eyes to the sum total of our ability to worship, to reflect, to do history and maths and music, and all of these things which are the most interesting part of us as human beings. So Andrew Steen says God cannot be deduced, only known. Here is this mind, however it formed, through whatever history, whatever accidents in the past. God cannot be deduced, only known. We have minds which can relate to our Creator. He says humans did not invent good, but became aware of it. We did not invent love, but it is a truth which we may see to manifest. How amazing that the mechanisms of genetics have produced a creature which transcends its genetics by entering into the realm of God. Second to lastly, order emerges from randomness. So jumping genes, retroviruses, they afflict us randomly. There is no set rule as to where they integrate into DNA, but at least some of them cause developments in our biology. So order arises from this genetic substrate, which is so variable. And Tom McLeish who I'm drawing from heavily here, wrote that in evolution as elsewhere, beauty and order arise from the chaotic world underneath them. So that's a Wikipedia picture, obviously. Biological processes depend on the wild frenzy of particle collisions. As the particles wheel around crazily, they are effectively exploring every possible shape or material combination. It is from within the chaos that overall order is formed and life exists. And Tom McLeish does describe how if you look at our cells under a microscope, you just see browning in motion. Cells are characterized by this random movement. In the cell, it's under control. So there's a ratchet so that the energy of the browning motion is used to drive this impeccably, wonderfully ordered, unbelievably complex thing we call a cell. So, life requires a substrate of random molecular motion. In the same way, the evolution of life itself falls into the category of ordered, large-scale structure emerging from random, small-scale dynamics at the level of the coding molecule of DNA. And the one example I've given you hopefully illustrates that. So here are a few scientists, again known and beloved by us, who say much the same thing, how in our genetic history, as well as in other histories, order emerges from this chaos. Paul Rolson says, life is destined to come as part of the narrative story, although the exact routes it takes are open and subject to historical vicissitudes. So there's randomness at base, but it's hidden. So God can bring about determinate ends through contingent parts. Retroviruses influence us and contingently, we can't control them, but there is an order in which those changes are selected. Andrew Briggs, although individual steps in evolution may be random, the overall direction is constrained by the way the world is. And again, Conway Morris says the ubiquity of convergence shows that biology travels through history but ends up at much the same destination. And I find that exciting because our own lives are like that, aren't they? And here Tom McLeish, I think, brings his understanding very close to our own struggles in life. Because Tom writes extensively about Job. For Job, the apparent randomness on the smaller scale is combining to form the order which emerges for creation as a whole. I used to struggle with the book of Job enormously. And when God eventually speaks to Job, it seems like a giant put down. But Tom McLeish helped me to see that Job was complaining about all the random things which occurred at the level of his own life, at the micro scale. Sickness and the death of his family, and raiders flying over the water. But when God addresses Job, God was saying, look, Job, look at the big picture. Meteorology, astronomy, the wonders of biology. When you look at the big picture, you see order. And so what God was saying, Job, don't think of your little self. There is order beyond the chaos of your own little life. So again, Tom McLeish with Hutchins, when apparent randomness threatens to destroy man's hope, it calls us to hold on in the belief that God is painting a better, bigger picture. God is found in both the chaos of the storm and the certainty of his love. God calls his people to believe that he is able to bring about in their lives what we have learned he brings about in nature, order from chaos. Order from chaos. And finally, the age-old problem of suffering, which has really focused people's minds on our mortality, where suffering precedes a completed creation. because those retroviruses, not only have they contributed towards what we are now, but en route, they've probably caused a lot of mutation and death. So we ask, how can God be working with a system which causes death and suffering? And Andrew Briggs says God bears a heavy responsibility for having brought into being and sustained in a world in which life-shattering processes go on for no fault of the creatures. And he's not the first person I've read who said God is responsible for what we see around us. It's a pretty hard thing to say. God is responsible. He ultimately bears responsibility. But then Rex continues, God bears a responsibility in a way that can ultimately merit our faith in him. We can still trust this God. And this includes a bearing of pain. That is God's bearing of pain. A fellowship with the insulted and humiliated. That is God's fellowship in Christ with the insulted and humiliated. And John Hopkins wrote this: the haunting problem posed by suffering is only adequately met in Christian thinking by a Trinitarian understanding of the cross of Christ, seen as the event in which the incarnate God truly shares to the uttermost the travail of creation. John Polkinghorne has said that suffering in creation is not gratuitous. It just has to be there in a free operation universe. It has to be there. Producing anything good has a cost, but God has paid that cost in Christ. So as I think about the costs and benefits of mutations in DNA, I think about the costs of the Creator himself, who has entered into the suffering, the variegated experience of our universe. If human beings are loved by their Creator, they must have a destiny beyond their deaths. They may hope to experience the healing of the universe and participate in the fulfillment of the divine purpose. I see it this way. Now, the image of God appears in three different contexts in Scripture. First of all, there's humanity, it's the image of God. And maybe that's the end result of 3.8 or 3.9 billion years of biological history. So we read in Genesis 1, at the end of that history, God's created, brought forth a creature who bore his image. And then, of course, Genesis makes it very clear that this creature is a pretty violent kind of being. So God called Israel. And at the end of Israel's traumatic history, again, chance and necessities. There's beauty in ugliness, there's peace and warfare. At the end of this history, God brings a person who bears his image perfectly. The outcome as a Christian of Israel's history, I see, as being the express image of God, who is Jesus himself. And then as we read the New Testament, there will be the time when that image of Jesus is conferred upon us who currently bear that image so perfectly. And of course, we aren't there yet. We do not yet fully bear the image of Christ. But because it's worked twice already, I have the confidence that the history which is yet to be completed will in fact be completed. So there we are, folks. I've given you just one little datum from our genetic history, and from that, science is God's gift. Biology as deeply historical, creation with its own potentiality, personhood discovered, order from randomness, and there will be consummation from suffering.
So, time for questions. A number of people have submitted questions online. Maybe I'll start with one of these, and anyone in the room has a question. So, this one says, some Christians are uncomfortable with the idea of random chance being involved in evolution because they feel it implies purposelessness. Do you want to comment on this?
Right, okay, thank you, Ruth. Yes, I remember once giving a talk in Wellington in New Zealand, and a biologist came to speak to me afterwards, and he rather rocked me because he said, I really liked what you said about evolution, which is not what I usually hear at the end of a talk. And then he said, but I don't like what you said about chance. And of course, he was a good, solid Presbyterian, so I hope it's all right to say that here. And I know that there is a strong school of thought that wants to see God's hand in everything. God causes everything. I don't believe that to be so. As I mentioned, my theology professor previously, Andrea Kernick, I did a VTH by correspondence with the University of South Africa. Dutch Reformed, but he was straining to get us away from that idea of an all-determining God. And he said, if we make God responsible for everything that happens in our world, we dishonor him. Because so many things which happen in this world are contrary to God's will. So many things that I do are contrary to God's will. So many things that humanity does are contrary to God's will. Sickness and death and cancer is contrary to God's will. He has given to his creation the gift of freedom, but in such a way that that freedom is channeled towards the final goals which God intended. And therefore, I think the cross is the perfect example of that. You know, when Judas and Caiaphas and Herod and Pilate got together, that was random. That was just human pig-headedness. But it was inevitable that Christ died. Now, mix those two together. The death of Christ is the most purposive thing that ever happened. It was written into creation eternally. But what Judas and Herod and all those things did was contrary to God's will. But he brings his own purposes out of the worst that created beings can do.
Thank you. If there are any questions in the room, just put your hand up. Yes. Are we using this? Just say your question.
What would you say if you met William Haley today? Because as I understand it, he kind of drew a line between what he suggested would be recreation by God and things which were not. He would say complexity was a great product of God's hand. Famous picture of the watch. How would you react to this distinction between complexity, irreducible complexity?
Right. Clearly, Haley didn't know the mechanisms which we know now. In fact, Darwin didn't know the mechanisms which we know now. It took 140 years, from my perspective, before the actual mechanisms of the strong basis of evolution was known. I guess that the paradigm of Paley was more of a static God, that things were designed just the way they are. What Darwin undid was the idea of such a static world. Darwin brought in the idea that in fact things were not created to fit in exactly to their environment, because environments change, rather they evolved to live within the environment that was available to them. So I think as now people who work in this area, and I was just a cell biologist doing cancer research, people who work in this area can see the mechanisms by which complexity develops. And I think the clearest example, which I have in my book, in a chapter, Evolution and Eschatology, is the evolution of the placenta. Sorry?
Sorry. It has to be whole before it will work.
No, it doesn't. Because even amongst mammals, there are many different types of placentas. And there are even some fish which have a placenta. And the thing is, the placenta is a very recent organ in evolutionary time.
Then you couldn't have had any babies.
Before that, no, that's fine. No, these are very important questions because they really answer or address what we were asked before. If you look at the platypus, it lays eggs. So it's a mammal. It lays wiry little eggs. It's a sort of mammal, but not quite. And then you look at marsupials, which have a very, very primitive placenta. They're metatherian. They don't have a proper placenta, but they're on the way. And their little joeys can sit in the pouch and suck milk from a very unformed mammary gland. And then you have to get to the fully placental mammals before the range of placenta appear. So it's an organ which is so recent in evolutionary time that you can see how the genetic regulation has appeared in eutherian, in fully placental mammals. So, I mean, the whole story is not there, of course, but yes, you can see the transition from a very primitive placenta in a wallaby to a highly formed placenta in a human being. But our placenta is very different from that, from a mouse's placenta, even though they're also the mammals. So they've evolved in different ways. So there's, again, randomness with convergence. Order has come out of randomness.
I feel it's too rude, I'm not going to talk.
Oh, we can continue the conversation later. Yes, great. So to continue on randomness, if you're all right with that, following on from a previous question, are you saying that randomness in the natural world is analogous to human free will?
Yeah, I am. Obviously, we are personal beings, and therefore, I'm not talking about randomness as you speak of a molecule moving, but appropriate to our nature as persons. We can choose to act contrary to the will of God. We can act without rational or moral basis. So in that sense, we can act independently of the will of God. So again, it comes back to what my professor said, that that's not everything that happens, or in fact, most of what happens is contrary to the will of God. Certainly in my own life, so many things have been contrary to the will of God, but he still works with that freedom to form me, increasingly, I hope, into someone who has the nature of Christ. Obviously, well, not obviously, there are some people who believe in panpsychism. I'm not one of them, not that I know much about it. But a molecule does its own thing, or a molecule of DNA does its own thing without a mind. That's its own proper form of freedom. Just as we have a form of freedom which is different from Brownian motion, but yeah, I see our freedom as being appropriate randomness in a sense, appropriate to knowing beings.
Right. And we've got time probably for maybe a couple more, but definitely one more question. There are a couple on suffering and there's one on the laws of nature.
Yeah.
What do you prefer?
Whatever you like, Ruth.
Okay, well, let's start with suffering because there are two on that.
Yes.
One of them says, for things like human suffering, you know, ranging from mental health, cancer, all sorts of things, how can one reason if it's a result of, I think this is looking at the book of Job, which you're talking about, how can one reason if it's a result of natural order or free will or Satan, or I would add, is it even necessary? What do you make of all those different options?
That's such a huge question. I did quote Professor Polkinghorne, who says that suffering is not gratuitous. It's just not that God is callous. It's just not God. It's not that God is cruel. But if we are to live in a real, there must be freedom such that we can be hurt by some things and helped by others, you know. We love a temperature of something like 37 degrees or slightly cooler, that we can freeze to death or get cooked. So inevitably we live in a temperate world where suffering, it can't be avoided. But what the Christian hope is that God will, through the sacrifice of his own son, bring in a world where suffering is not necessary and is not needed. So we look forward to a new heavens and a new earth. But I don't think we can get away from suffering. It's part of being where we are. And in fact, pain, of course. I don't know whether any of you have read Pain, the Gift That Nobody Wants, by Yancey and Brand. Paul Brand was a leper surgeon. And he says how important is the gift of pain. Lepers lose their hands and feet, not because of the bacterium, mycobacterium leper, but because they lose their sensitivity to pain. And they can walk all day in poorly fitting shoes and then just wear their feet to the bone. So pain, unfortunately, is absolutely necessary.
Thank you, Graeme, and thank you so much for answering all our questions.
I don't know that answer.